Many thanks to the University of Utah for convening this symposium and inviting me to be a part of it. It's a special pleasure to honor the memory of Wallace Stegner, one of the nation's great authors and environmentalists. We've been experiencing some wonderful talks, some wonderful presentations, and in my own case, a little bit of sensory overload. And as a result, this is a talk that has no illustrations. The lights are going to be on the whole time, and it's all words. We heard David Sandalow say that yesterday, and you need some respite, or contrast, I should say, to the beautifully illustrated talks or the highly outlined talks. This is just going to be a summary of my thoughts. And the topic that I've been asked to make some remarks about is, why has the public been slow to grasp the reality of global climate change? Now, I come into the subject of climate change from the scientific side. And for decades, as a geophysicist, I've been involved with work like David Chapman described yesterday so nicely. We have been taking the temperature of the rocks beneath the Earth's surface and translating those temperatures into what it tells us about climate change. I have testified before the United States Senate with Lonnie Thompson, who you heard yesterday. Just earlier this week, I was in Washington giving a presentation to the National Academy of Science Committee. That John Christie was a member of that committee. So I'm engaged in the scientific aspects of the climate change story. From the point of view of the science, and I think that many of you will agree, we heard a lot of science today, that the story of climate change and of the human role in it has reached what I would call, if not an overwhelming consensus, at least a strong consensus among the scientific community that it's real, climate is changing significantly, humans are playing a role in it, it's going to have consequences that we need to think about. So it's always taken me a little by surprise to learn how slowly the reality of anthropogenic climate change that we as scientists seem to be confident about, that it's being little comprehended by the non-scientific public. There's probably been no other scientific topic in the last decade that has been, I think, more shrouded in puzzlement and uncertainty than that of global climate change. So as a result, in addition to continuing my work in climate science, I've also become a quasi-social scientist, in the sense that I want trying to understand what's behind the public ambivalence in terms of their understanding and comprehension of what I consider the reality of climate change. And in speaking outside of scientific circles, of course, we're moving out of our comfort zone and addressing people who don't think the same way you do, or the same way I do. And that's a challenge that a lot of people are not willing to always accept. So I was pleased when Ernie Westman stood up this morning, and he said, "What's a nice guy like me doing in a place like this?" It's like going into the den of lions. And sometimes I feel exactly the same way, because I think it's important that although the scientists have to talk with each other and they have to have their arguments and their discussions and make sure that the science is right, ultimately we have to talk with people who don't agree with us and find out why they don't agree with you and see what you can do to maybe persuade them a little bit about maybe their beliefs could undergo some change. And so as a result, I spend a fair amount of time talking to people who are not scientists. I talk to Rotary clubs, Kiwanis clubs, I talk to university alumni clubs, I talk to legislative staffers. I go on trips with eco-tourists and lecture. And all these people I consider to be mature, educated adults who are seriously interested in the subject, but they don't have a lot of basis to fully evaluate what they see as conflicting information and conflicting views about climate change. And in particular, they don't see a basis that could be translated into what would be wise public policy. So I've often heard, and I'm sure that you have, that the climate science is too uncertain to serve as a basis for public policy. And I, of course, don't worry about uncertain science because I don't think science is ever certain, and that uncertainty is an illusion. If you think you can overcome it, it always is one step away from you. It's like a mirage on the horizon. So I'm a great believer that one makes decisions in the face of uncertainty, and that you have to move on without all the answers. That's what I always tell people. You can't wait till you have all the answers because you won't have them. So I actually wrote a book, which Dave Chapman kindly advertised yesterday. Good to see a lot of copies selling on the bookshelf back there. There are fewer waving them in front of me. Always pleased that people are buying my book. But that was an outcome of a lot of my experiences in talking to non-scientific groups and trying to explain scientific uncertainty and how one needs to move on without all the answers. And in that book, the underlying theme is the story of climate change, which is the one I'm most familiar with. Now, what I've learned in talking with lots of non-scientists is that it's a very complex topic to people, and when they say, oh, I don't believe in climate change, when you probe them, there are different aspects of it that they might not believe, but it's not just a uniform condemnation or rejection of the ideas that Earth's climate might be changing. Some people will be debating, is the climate really changing? In other words, they're puzzled about the actual evidence that leads scientists to say that the climate is changing. Others will say, well, I believe the climate's changing, but we don't have any idea what's causing it. Maybe it's all natural causes. Others say it's human causes. So I think we're back on square one in terms of understanding climate change. Some accept the fact that humans are playing a role in it, but they say, who cares? The consequences may not be great, or we may love it. It's going. Who in Michigan wouldn't like to have warmer winters? On my way out here, of course, at the Detroit airport, we had to stop for de-icing the airplane, and it was a pleasure to get to Salt Lake, where people are walking around without jackets and such. But nevertheless, there is a body of thinking that says that global warming will not be, on the whole, a bad thing. Now, I know we've heard lots of contrary evidence today, and I'm one who thinks that the losers will far outnumber the winners in climate change. But others accept all the facts that climate is warming, humans are probably behind it in an increasing measure, that it's not going to be a good thing. And the issues then are, what are we going to do about it? And there will be big disagreements about what the policies addressing it. And I was again impressed that Ernie Westman said that's where he was. He accepts that all the things that we know the science has told us about climate, but is still, what are the right policies to address it? Well, by and large, the public rolls all of these things together into a tangled knot of yarn. And so I've always tried to untangle it and ask exactly what part of the climate change story don't you agree with, or what part of it puzzles you. And usually you can find out that, say, well, I think that, yes, I think the climate's changing, the evidence is strong, and I know that humans are playing a role, but I think all these computer models of the future are nonsense. And so we talk about computer modeling, and I tell them, kind of the progress that's been made in computer modeling, and Warren Washington showed us some very nice steps along the way today of how the resolution is improving and the models are becoming more complex. So I try and ease the discomfort that they have with one or another parts of the story. You know, in thinking about why there's been so much puzzlement and uncertainty, there are a lot of reasons behind it. And here, if there are real social scientists in the audience, please forgive me for my kind of simplistic personal analysis of this. But I want to list what I call some genuine reasons for puzzlement and uncertainty, and then address some that probably are not so, well, they're real enough, but they don't have a strong basis. So let me go through a few that I think are real reasons why humans have a hard time grasping the realities of climate change. The first on the list is that it's difficult for humans to think on large spatial scales and long temporal scales. We have evolved over the thousands of years of evolution. I can use that word. That's right. And but in the early days of human evolution, you know, the people who lived in the caves really weren't concerned whether it was raining or snowing or the climate was getting colder on the other side of the earth. And they weren't concerned or caring about whether it's increasing by a degree over a century. They had more important things to think about. They had to find food every day. They had to make sure that they were not food for someone else. And the evolution of the human species is taught them to be very attentive to their immediate environment. And I thought it was interesting that John Christie today, the two examples he gave is the San Joaquin Valley, where he grew up, and Alabama, where he works. And he's shown a lot of intense local interest in those areas that he's most familiar with. Experience is always at the local scale. None of us live globally. We always live someplace and in a particular window of time. Moreover, we are always born into a certain situation. And we tend to think that that's normal. That's what we were born into. We don't always have an historical perspective. We certainly don't have it when we're born. And I also found it very interesting that Sheila Watt-Cloutier said that it's the responsibility of the elders to tell the newborn, the next generation, where they have come from, culturally, historically, ecologically, and now I would argue climatologically as well. It's a very important role that we have to play to overcome this local outlook and short-term outlook. We have to begin to develop ways of thinking globally and thinking on long timescales. As another example, we long ago came to recognize that we can't use our rivers and lakes as a sewer. We have legislation against that. We will make sure that if there are violators that they pay for it, or we'll try to. But we still use the atmosphere as an open sewer. The atmosphere is a global phenomenon, and we don't think of it as we do our local lakes or rivers. And as a result, what we know is wrong locally, we have not yet quite grasped there can be an equal wrong on a global basis. And so we have to overcome our natural tendencies to think locally and on short time terms to graduating into a longer term perspective and one that looks at the entire globe. Now the second point that I think is a reason that we find climate change hard to grasp is that humans face to face with tsunamis that kill 300,000 people, an earthquake that kills 80,000 people, a hurricane that floods an entire city. It's difficult for humans to think that they have any power in the world. Faced with the powers of nature, with these tremendous natural events, most people say, wow, am I ever puny in the face of all the powers of nature? And it's a correct observation that every individual is puny in the face of the powers of nature. But what we need to realize is that collectively we're not puny at all. There are 6 billion people plus on Earth, and today humans are the most important agent of change on the planet. Humans move more Earth than rivers do. We have changed the hydrological cycle in parts of the Earth with our building of dams and diversion of waters. And we've changed the atmospheric composition, and we've heard a lot of the evidence for that, and there's no need to repeat it. Humans have added a huge amount of carbon dioxide to the atmosphere. A second aspect of this feeling that individually we're impotent is in looking towards the remedies. People say, what can I do? I'm just one person. Or can anything be done about it? It's too big. It's bigger than all of us. And we need to get over that attitude as well. We need to recognize that with just as individually we may not be much, but collectively we are very powerful, both in understanding our role in nature and in recognizing that we were powerful enough to alter nature, we are powerful enough to do something about it. And so I don't want any of you to ever let anyone say, well, there's nothing we can do about it. People have to realize that they are part of the cause, and they have to be part of the solution in a collective way. Now, a third area that I think leads to puzzlement, I say us, and now I'm talking about, of course, the general public, is that our science education is generally not very good. I don't think the schools and the universities do a great job in teaching people about the way science works. They're too busy teaching students to answer the questions and not busy enough teaching students to question the answers. Albert Einstein said that you're not going to find the solutions to today's problems with today's conventional wisdom. Today's conventional wisdom is what caused the problems. It's not going to be the solution to them. So we need to have an education system that is different than what we have now. And I'm not an educator in the general sense. You know, I'm just a lowly university professor and with a small access to the educational system. But I know that because our science education is not great, the general public is not well equipped to separate, on the one hand, real scientific issues from self-serving propaganda. They don't have a good way of evaluating it. Now, for instance, we talk about the global average temperature, and if you ask someone, let's say from Salt Lake, and they say the global average temperature went up, well, last year was cold here. What is it that, how can you talk about global warming when we were actually cold? Well, a good scientist knows, and John Christie knows this too, that John knows that any average is made up of some things that are above average, some things that are below average, and in terms of warming, you could have a global average warming, and some regions would be cooling. And it's important to point that out, and he's done that. When we want to understand why certain areas are cooling when the globe, on average, is warming. But John, of course, knows that. David Chapman knows that. Bill Curry knows that. But the general public will ask, well, if the globe warmed last year, why didn't Omaha, Nebraska, or why didn't Miami, Florida? They don't even appreciate the fact that just because there's an average increase, that every place is not increased. And it's that simple sense of how to comprehend scientific information that I think has not served us well. I mean, our educational system has not served us well. Now, another aspect of our education is that I think that there's been a failure to instill in students the ability to evaluate the power of many lines of independent evidence. Confidence in an answer should rise rapidly if the same result is obtained by many independent means, even though each independent approach may have uncertainty to it, that the ensemble of independent results has a much higher confidence than the confidence of any single part. And that kind of thinking has escaped a lot of people. For instance, in the evidence for climate change, quite aside from the issue of whether our thermometers are measuring what we think they're measuring, and I think that John showed us some interesting examples, particularly with the Sierra and the agricultural valley contrast, we need to understand those issues. But nature has its own thermometers as well, and they tell us in a number of ways that the climate is changing. We've heard mountain glaciers almost everywhere in the world are melting back. We can look at the dates when rivers freeze in the fall and melt in the spring, and the ice period is getting shorter. The southern margin of snowfall is moving northward. The southern margin of permafrost is moving northward. The growing season in Alaska has increased by 2 weeks in the last half century. There's changes in the active layer that we heard about the other day. The area of Greenland that is undergoing summer melting has been increasing. The number of tundra travel days, which we also heard about, is getting shorter each year. All of these things have some uncertainty to them. But in my mind, the ensemble of those results give a very compelling case that the Earth is indeed warming, and quite independent of our thermometers at weather stations. So the collective ensemble of independent evidence is not appreciated. The usual misinterpretation, or I should say misdirected interpretation, there's far more of a tendency to focus on the weakness of the parts rather than on the strength of the whole. And so someone will say, well, I know a lot about the growing season in Alaska, and it's because of X, Y, and Z special circumstances. There's a lot of other ways to explain that other than climate change. Or maybe about the freezing and thawing of lakes. Well, there's so many pollutants that are changing the freezing point of water. But again, although you can poke holes or try to attack in each individual piece, it's the collective ensemble that really, to me, is the compelling and an almost unassailable body of information that tells us that climate is changing. But the public doesn't understand that real well. But what I've also discovered is that, and it's not unrelated to the fact that we don't think in long terms and over half centuries where there's been an increase in the growing season or a decrease in the interval of time where lakes are frozen, the public does get its attention drawn to events. Katrina, when we get a 14-inch rainfall in North Dakota, as we did a couple of years ago in one day, an extreme weather event, lots of other explanations for it, but 14 inches in North Dakota is half of the annual rainfall, and that's all in one day. When 30,000 people die in Europe in a heat wave 2 summers ago, when the Mississippi River undergoes a 500-year flood in 1993, when West Texas goes 94 days without rainfall. These are the things that catch people's attention. And they're much harder individually to attribute to climate change, to global warming. But again, as an ensemble, they are beginning to grab the public's attention. I think the public would be better served in looking at the longer-term data. But the event-driven visibility is what has captured the public's imagination about climate change and has in fact been what I think is slowly moving the public to accept the reality of climate change. I would hope that they would understand the more basic science rather than the event, but I'm willing to accept a recognition of a changing world that is event-driven if I can't get the public to pay attention to longer-term trends. Now, I mentioned the fact that the public is drawn to events. That's because the media is drawn to events. Thank you. The media is drawn to events, and because that's news. Science has been said to be a long movie, whereas the media likes to take snapshots. And unless you have snapshots very, very regularly, you don't see the movie evolving. And so the media has, I think, not done a good job of helping to educate the public because its mode of operation is really quite different. The media doesn't have time to devote to long-term coverage. Tomorrow there's another event that drives the news, not what happened today. And then I must also say that the media reporters are the products of the same educational system that has made the general public not so readily capable of untangling the threads of a complex story. One more item that I think is a natural reason, one that I'm not at all proud of, is that there's been an increasing level of scientific fraud, which makes the public more cautious in accepting scientific pronouncements and more skeptical of the adequacy of peer review. I just mentioned a few of recent times, the Korean stem cell research fraud of just a few months ago, cancer studies in Norway that were based on fraudulent data, condensed matter physicist at Bell Labs who a few years ago was publishing papers left and right. He was said to be on the Nobel track until it turned out that they were all fraudulent. And this does not do science any good. Peer review eventually uncovers these things because people try to repeat the experiments and the repetition is not possible. But the public doesn't follow the scientific activity of testing. They simply see the fraud in the news and they're worried. All right, so much for all the reasons that I consider genuine reasons why the public has a hard time grasping the reality. There's also some other reasons that I think deserve mention. I call that the hostility to science. There are a lot of people who just don't like what science is telling them and try to discredit it. There's a language, you'll recognize these phrases, of unsound science, junk science, unsettled science, uncertain science. Michael Crichton's book is a good example of kind of doing things like that. Of course, he says, first line, this is a work of fiction. But you know full well that lots of people say, you know, Michael Crichton has really debunked the whole story of climate change, which he hasn't. But nevertheless, by implying that much of science is bad, you're not helping the public to realize that most of science is good. It's not all of first-rank importance. There's a lot of pedestrian work that goes on filling in gaps. But nevertheless, most of science is sound and is making progress in understanding complex systems. Now, when we look at some of the environmental issues of the past, there's always been an antagonism towards the initial pronouncement that there's an environmental problem. When Rachel Carson wrote her book Silent Spring, the agricultural pesticides industry said, who is this person? You know, she doesn't have a degree in chemistry or in biology. I won't go through all the adjectives that were used to describe Rachel Carson, but ultimately, she was right. acid rain in the coal industry. You'll recall when the early attributions of acid rain in the East was from burning high sulfur coal in Midwest power plants. The electrical power industry said, nonsense, it couldn't happen, and a lot of other things too. Same issue with the discovery of the environmental aspects of lead. The leaded gasoline industry said, can't be us. But, and they also said, we can't take lead out of gasoline. It's going to, you won't have an engine that can run without leaded gasoline. Well, of course, we know that we had engines that were quickly adapted to non-leaded gasoline. We heard it about from the synthetic chemical industry when the chlorofluorocarbons were pointed out as the cause of ozone depletion. We heard it from the tobacco industry when the smoking-related health problems became apparent. And to some extent, we've heard it from the fossil fuel industry with respect to climate change. There are vested interests who don't want things to change, and they'll challenge you with, usually with arguments that science doesn't say that, the science certainly there's no uniformity about it, there's uncertainty, there's still a lot of unsettled science, and we can't make any decisions until the uncertainties are reduced. There's also philosophical antagonists against science. And here I come to the issues between creation and intelligent design and evolution. These people don't like what science is telling them about the way life has evolved on Earth. And they have recognized that there's also certain people who don't like the story of what climate change is telling us. And so there's been an unholy alliance, frankly, between some of the creation science adherents and some of the people who don't like the climate change story. I was pleased to see that the Utah legislature just this week took a vote that excluded any reference to evolution and creationism in their science curriculum and had a very general statement. But it's not so in Michigan, where I come from. The Michigan House of Representatives in 2005 had Bill 5251 introduced, which would revise the recommended Model Core academic curriculum content standards in science to ensure that pupils will be able to critically evaluate scientific theories, including but not limited to the theories of global warming and evolution, and use relevant scientific data to assess the validity of those theories and to formulate arguments for or against those theories. I won't go into much more of that except to say that there is, as I say, this unholy alliance between people who just don't like science, like what science is telling them, and will team up with anyone who they think might be like-minded. And then we come to the federal government. The federal government intrinsically need not be hostile to science, but the present administration is. The present administration distorts the science, it exaggerates uncertainty, it intimidates the scientists, it suppresses results, and it's a very unhealthy setting that is developing because it plants seeds of doubt in the general public. There are still some who think that the government can do no wrong. And we've seen examples, I think, of all of the examples that I said, distorting the science, intimidating the scientists, suppressing results, all in very recent times. But it's been characteristic of the administration over its full 6 years in office so far. Now, the business of uncertainty that our present administration says there's much too much uncertainty to move ahead with climate change policies. I don't think that uncertainty is in fact a reason to not move ahead with policy. As I said, I don't think you'll ever eliminate uncertainty, and so if you say you're going to wait till the uncertainty is gone, that's an implicit endorsement for the status quo. And I would add that among the uncertainty of the climate science, we heard some good talks today about the temperature record, about the way models have evolved. But a lot of the uncertainty about the predictions of the climate change over the next century are not really uncertainties about climate science. They're uncertainties about social science. How many people are going to be living in 50 years from now? What's going to be their lifestyle? How much energy are they going to consume? How interconnected will the global economy be? These are not issues of climate science. These are issues of social science. They impact heavily on our policy making, but let's not take the rap as scientists that there's too much uncertainty in the climate science. A good piece of the uncertainty is always going to be in the social science, and those issues will not be resolved in a time frame. We'll never know how many people are going to be living 50 years hence, because there's always a 50-year window ahead of us. So those questions don't disappear. You just have to make policy in the face of uncertainty. You have to move on without all the answers. And the way you do that is you make policy that has evaluation built into it, so that if you are moving in the wrong direction, if policy turns out to have adverse effects, you have mid-course corrections. That's called adaptive management. You're never going to see the future so clearly that you'll have the right policy in place today that will have no need for correction 50 years from now. But we need to get started with actions and policy implementation. I was a little disappointed to hear this morning that the electric utility industry is risk adverse. They are awaiting the certainty of regulation. Frankly, that's not the way that most innovation in America proceeds. We admire entrepreneurs. Why do we admire entrepreneurs? We admire them because they're risk takers. But what risk is there if there's no uncertainty? Risk exists because there is uncertainty, and that those who take the risks and monitor their progress carefully and make mid-course corrections in a timely fashion are the ones who shape the future. The people who say, you know, we're waiting for the certainty of regulation and we're risk adverse, they have relegated themselves to a following role rather than a leading role. And maybe that's a proper role for the electrical industry, but it's in contrast to the way that much of American innovation has proceeded. So anyway, I think those are all reasons why the public has been slow to grasp the reality of climate change. But I think that there is light at the end of the tunnel. We've heard a lot about how public opinion is slowly recognizing climate change and that humans are playing a role in it. They're not in full agreement as to what we should be doing about it, but at least there is a movement towards a majority of Americans recognizing that climate change is real and that it is a problem. It's been a long time coming. In this morning's Wall Street Journal, there was a little clip that said, just a factoid, that the Antarctic ice sheet, the cover of the Antarctic continent, has been diminishing in area over the last 3 years. That, 5 years ago would have been censored from the Wall Street Journal. Now it's listed as a factoid. Now, in conclusion, yes, I think that we're at a tipping point of public acknowledgement, recognition, and concern. But I think we're also much closer to the tipping point in the climate system. In other words, the public awareness reaching a tipping point towards belief has been at the expense of a decade or more of the climate system, just like a roller coaster climbing up the ramp at the beginning, slowly, 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 slowly. And then when you go over the top, you're in for one real ride. I think we're a lot closer to that tipping point than many of us sense or want to believe. Whether we like it or not, we're in for a lot of adventure in the next half century. The carbon dioxide levels, the rates of emission may be reduced through all the good suggestions that we've had from many speakers. But even as we saw today, even if we would just stop emitting right today, there's enough inertia in our climate system that there are some changes that are going to unfold. And don't believe for a moment that we're going to have zero emissions tomorrow. We're going to continue pumping carbon dioxide, other greenhouse gases into the atmosphere, and we're going to, I think, start the wild roller coaster ride. So an important component of the future planning has to be adaptation. We're going to see a lot of things happening that are, at least for a while, irreversible. Sea level rise, changes in the Arctic that we heard about in such a moving way this morning. These are changes that we're going to have to face. And I know that it may be unsettling to you to realize that the world as we know it probably is not going to continue exactly as we've grown up with it. And we're, as I say, in for one wild ride. Thank you very much.
We're a little short on time, so I'm just going to limit it to a couple questions. So I'll let you make that choice.
Yes.
There's one party in that list of offenders against understanding that you didn't mention having any responsibility. The old saying about "we met the enemy and it's us" seems to fall on yet another area of concern. We're going to address this problem. Don't you think we need to deal with the self-interest that is the incentive for accepting all of the fog?
Well, to the extent that it exists, I think that has to be added to the list. It's not something that I've thought a great deal about. And you may be absolutely right that there's a social mindset that needs to be readjusted. And it may well be. But again, it's a big social science issue and not so much a natural science one. Yes. Yes. It's hard to predict. The question is, what will the not-so-brave new world be like? And we don't know for sure. We don't know exactly when the tipping points come. But I think that predicting the future is difficult. And you can't, number one, you can't believe predictions as gospel. Most of them are wrong in some respect. So you have to be prepared for surprises. I call them climate surprises. One is the melting of the Arctic and the alteration of thermohaline circulation. Another is the release of methane from the permafrost. Each of those can be climate surprises that we don't know exactly when they're coming. But I assert that we're in for big change. I can't tell you exactly what it'll be, but there's so many things that are nearing what I call important thresholds that I think we need to be worried. Yeah. Okay, one more.
You spoke about politics and philosophy and economics. I was curious to know what you think about religion, how that actually plays a role in people's understanding.
Religion, the question was, what role does religion play in concert with politics, economics, and the like? Religion plays an important role. And religion cannot be a unified opinion. I mean, you should not think of it, there's a religious point of view. But religious points of view are also divided. The The Bible, to some, says that God gave us the earth to take care of, which is kind of the environmentalist point of view. And another says God gave us the earth to serve us, that we are in dominion over the earth, and that all resources and everything are only to serve mankind and the like. Those two elements of religion are present. And the ones who have said that we are given God's creation to take care of have just made a major statement within the last month. It's a coalition of evangelical communities around the nation that made a strong case that we're not taking good care of God's creation. So I think there is a big role for religion, and they are playing a bigger role. The faith-based community, as we know in other political arenas, is not one to be ignored. And I, for one, am happy that they've joined the fray.
Thank you again, Henry.
Thank you.